Hey guys, welcome back to Fast Keto. Thank you so much for being here. I am so excited for today's episode with Menno Henselmans. He is an international public speaker, scientist, and online physique coach, and he is an expert in research when it comes to body recomposition. We talk a ton about evidence-based fitness education and how much protein to eat in a day, how to optimize your protein intake for fitness, for lean gains, for body recomposition and fat loss. He has had hundreds of students, and he recently published a best-selling book called The Science of Self-Control. And we talk about some really big insights with regards to productivity and discipline and willpower. So it's a great episode with a ton of takeaways, and he really provided so much great information on this episode. So I know you guys are going to enjoy it so much. If you know of anyone that you think would enjoy this episode as well, please do share it with them. And let's get into the episode with Menno Henselmans. Welcome to the Tone Device, the newest breath ketone analyzer by Ketogenic Girl. With the Tone Device, you can instantly know if you are burning body fat. You can say goodbye to expensive, painful ketone testing. With the Tone Device, you simply breathe into the device and you will get an instant reading, letting you know if you are burning fat or in the fat burning zone. With the Tone Device, you can now more easily and effectively reach your fitness goals using the feedback that it provides. Welcome to the Tone Device. Welcome to unlimited testing. Buy yours today and get in the fat burning zone. All right, Meno, welcome to Fast Keto. Thank you so much for being here with us today and taking the time.
My pleasure.
How are you doing? You're in Madrid at the moment, is that right?
Yes, I'm currently in Madrid, and it's going very well. Yeah, things are pretty steady here, and pandemic-wise.
Yeah, that's great. I'm in Prague, so it's also dark here. I don't know if it's the same there, but it's pretty dark out. I wanted to congratulate you on releasing your new book. It looks like it did really well, and it looks like you put a lot of science into it, but also a lot of easy sort of takeaways for people that they can implement, directly into their lives. So I'm excited to talk about that.
Yeah, definitely. That was definitely my intention, make the book practical as well, because it has over 500 scientific references, but also 53, and actually more if you count sub-tips, 53 tips that make it very concrete, like what exactly do I recommend you do? Because I find that is lacking in a lot of self-help books.
Yeah, well, I'm really excited to talk about willpower, self-control, self-discipline, and productivity and optimizing for that. But just to start off with, let's talk a little bit about fitness and, basically getting lean. That's sort of something that most people are interested in. I know that you're very much evidence-based. I would love to start off just asking you, what are sort of the maybe 2 or 3 top myths that you see out there that people believe about getting lean that are totally false as evidence in studies that you sort of see being propagated and you wish they would just die?
There are a lot. I think the 6 meals a day is still something that a lot of people think is kind of true, especially in the more mainstream. Like you need a high meal frequency to get lean, and that's absolutely not the case. There's lots and lots of research now that very conclusively shows that your meal frequency, independent of energy intake, has basically 0 effect on fat loss. Now, I would say that for appetite management and muscle retention, which most people want even if you're not exercising, you should have at least 3 meals a day. 2 might be feasible in certain circumstances, especially if you don't do structured exercise. But I generally recommend 3 minimum. Other than that, it really doesn't matter so much. Breakfast is not an essential meal. That would be another myth. This idea of, breakfast like a king, dinner like a pauper, I think is the saying.
Yeah, breakfast is the most important meal of the day is a big one.
Yeah, that's absolutely false. Again, it's independent of energy restriction. Breakfast or no breakfast does not matter. Or, technically speaking, if your first meal is lunch, that is breakfast, right? Then you break the fast. But this idea that you have to eat early after waking up, it's not true. Now, it can help. There is quite some research actually showing that, especially in overweight individuals, they find it easier to go through the day with breakfast than if they don't have it. And this is especially true in carb intolerant individuals. And that's probably because the morning is one of the only times that if you're carb intolerant, you have somewhat good insulin sensitivity. And we see that there are fewer glucose excursions if you have a breakfast in that case, and it helps with appetite management and adherence, which in return lowers energy intake intuitively, generally, which in turn leads to greater fat loss.
Yeah, that's also a great one out there. It really, people really do believe that, they have to eat breakfast and yet, when you sort of see the benefits of intermittent fasting or maybe pushing back your first meal, that's definitely a topic that I want to get into because, it's important to balance sort of your goals with intermittent fasting and muscle building. So one of the things I'm on a mission to do is to help sort of the average woman understand how she can build muscle, how she can do that in an optimal way. And a lot of this stuff has sort of been more of a male domain for a long time. Or if it's female or women are involved, it's usually in some kind of competitive space. But for the average woman out there, in order to improve her metabolic health, building muscle is really important, as retaining muscle, especially as you're having, muscle protein breakdown occurring at greater percentages later in life is so important. So what's your advice in terms of protein intake for the average woman who may or may not be training with that as well?
But if they are training, then I recommend 1.8 grams per kilogram per day minimum. Most research, including the latest meta-analysis that I co-authored, finds there are no significant benefits above 1.6 gram per kilogram per day. I think that is 0.72 grams per pound of total body weight per day for the Americans. And if you're not exercising, 1.2, I think, is the consensus at this point. Now, we're not actually a consensus. There are still a lot of more old school researchers that stick to the 0.8 or 0.9, but there are now quite some studies showing benefits for lean body mass retention and appetite regulation of going up to at least 1.2. So regardless of whether you're exercising or not, I think relatively high protein diets, depending on what you call high, but by research standards, it's high, is advisable because it has a lot of benefits and very few drawbacks.
Yes, I agree. Now, one question that I have is, do you change that recommendation based on age? Because we know muscle protein synthesis is, mostly dependent on age in terms of, how easy it is to trigger. So for women who are, say, postmenopausal or who are dealing with that greater percentage of muscle protein breakdown, do you have different recommendations?
So up to age 75 or so, I think the research is quite firm that recommendations don't need to change. Body weight may change and therefore protein intake may increase or decrease somewhat, but the relationship between body composition and protein requirements is essentially the same. Now, when you get to the elderly, as most research defines elderly as 66 plus, things get a little murkier because we don't have as much research and it's hard to separate, whether someone's doing serious strength training and whether that's an optimized program. But there was actually a review published just last month, I think, actually, by Moore, that concluded, which I tend to agree with, that protein requirements still don't change. It does seem like they might need to change because elderly individuals and some other individuals as well, especially obese individuals, have anabolic resistance, which means basically they have a harder time building muscle. So when they consume protein, they don't increase their protein synthesis as much as other individuals. Now, a way to get around that is to have bigger servings of protein. So research finds that elderly individuals should actually refrain from going with, say, 6 meals a day, and they'd be better off with 3 or 4 to make sure that every meal's protein intake crosses what's called the leucine threshold. Basically, it's a robust anabolic stimulus to make sure that the body registers there is enough protein and it kickstarts all the processes for muscle growth. Now, you might think, well, if we can do that, then we can just have more protein, right? And we get a bigger or the same effect. But that doesn't appear to be the case, because there's something called the muscle full effect, which basically says that there is a limited amount of protein synthesis that the muscle will allow. You can't just eat yourself to, the Mr. Olympia size. There has to be a corresponding stimulus for the body to create new muscle or other lean body mass. So typically, especially if you're not exercising, if you're eating excess protein, it will simply be metabolized, used for energy rather than used for protein synthesis.
Right. That makes sense. I've looked at some research saying that for individual adults over the age of 60, that basically the leucine requirements were about 3 grams, but then I've also seen things saying that it should be 5 to 6. So, I'm just not sure, how much is adequate for people who are sort of over the age of 60.
General recommendation is to get 40 grams of high quality protein, or at least 40 grams of protein, of which at least half is high quality, but preferably just 40 gram high quality probably per meal. And you get that 3 or 4 times a day.
Yeah, that makes sense. Now, in terms of balancing intermittent fasting with getting your protein, I've seen research talking about sort of eating 4 meals a day being optimal for having that nutrient trigger for MPS, and then, also, just maximizing how much muscle you're building within the spacing of your workout. But then there are people who are doing intermittent fasting. I know there are benefits with intermittent fasting. To me, though, the primary one is sort of caloric reduction or caloric control. So, it would seem that a lot of people would think, well, is it better to get sort of 4 meals in, or is it better to do, 2 or 3 meals with more intermittent fasting?
Yeah, they're not necessarily mutually exclusive, but I agree in practice they kind of are. It's hard to fit in 4 meals if you have, say, an 8-hour eating window, and probably doesn't make a lot of sense. So that's actually the research on intermittent fasting is a primary reason that I also don't think you need 4 meals a day. I think 3 meals a day, if they're spaced relatively well apart and you sandwich your workout relatively well with meals, good recommendation is to have no more than a 5 to 6 hour intermeal window between the workout. So basically, if you have 1 meal, and somewhere you work out after that meal, and you want to have the next meal no more than 6 hours and probably ideally 5 hours after that meal, so that you don't go too long in a fasted state before and after the workout. I think if you do that, then 3 meals is probably sufficient. There have been a few studies, including one relatively recent, that found no difference between 3 and 6 meals a day this was, I think, in sedentary individuals, but we also have some research in strength-trained individuals, including the Norwegian Frequency Project, which I'm not sure was ever really fully published, but it's one of the few good studies we have where they had 2 groups basically doing everything the same, but one with 3 meals and one with 6 meals a day. They found basically no differences between groups in muscle growth, strength development, overall body composition change. In fact, there was some trend for the 3 meal group to do better, but I wouldn't read too much into that. So I think overall 3 meals is probably fine, and most research on intermittent fasting also shows that as long as you have the same total macronutrient intake, at least in energy deficit, because that's almost all fasting research is on energy deficient individuals, is fine.
Yeah, that makes sense. So if you were doing 3 meals a day, then what would you recommend for an average female adult, or I guess would it be different for men than how much protein per meal?
Probably if you spread it out relatively equally, especially if you're not working out, that's fine. If you're not working out, it probably doesn't even matter that much, especially if you're young, because the leucine threshold might exist, and it might be about 20 grams of protein per meal. So that's a good guideline. Another guideline is to have at least 0.3 gram per kilogram body weight per meal, which generally works out to about 20 grams. If you're exercising, you can probably do the same, but you want to make sure that you have the post-workout periods covered in particular. So I recommend doubling that, say 40 grams or at least 0.6 gram per kilogram in the first post-workout meal, because then you initiate then you have a big part of the spike in protein synthesis after the workout. And in general, you want to backload the protein a little bit more towards the later meals.
Right. So that would look like, as an example, you have your first meal with 20 grams of protein in there, and then you work out, and then you have a second meal with 40 grams of protein, and those two meals and that workout all being within 5 to 6 hours. And then you have a third and final meal, which could have 20 grams of protein.
Yeah, probably something like 20, 40, 40, especially if you're strength training.
20, 40, 40. Okay.
Yeah, about 100 grams. The good guideline is also, I don't like women going under 100 grams. Now, if you do 1.8 times body weight, then you'd have to be 50 kilogram or less, basically, or fewer, to get to that level. But I don't recommend going lower, even if you are lower in body weight than that, because interestingly, it's actually quite contentious if protein requirements really vary that much per body weight. It's sort of assumed, and there are also people that say, they go so far as to say you should not base it on body weight, but on lean body weight.
Yes.
Now, I don't think that's practical, because then you have to estimate your body fat percentage, and that has a lot of error, and it's difficult, and it just induces more error probably than it's worth. Because the only study we have that actually tested if protein requirements vary based on someone's weight or lean body mass found that they did not vary based on either weight or lean body mass. So that would suggest it's probably more, every individual has a certain protein requirement, and these might differ for men and women. But whether you gain muscle or lose fat, these requirements don't actually change that much. So that's why I'm hesitant to go below about 100 grams for anyone, basically.
Yeah, that's the reason why I don't usually recommend it based on body weight, but more so, how much leucine are you getting, and I'd love to talk about what you define as high quality protein for people.
That's relatively simple, I think, based on most indices. The PDAAS or PCDAAS is, I think, the most established latest one, but there are like 5 indices, and they all converge on the fact that animal protein basically is high quality and plant protein is not. So poultry, fish, meat, dairy, that's all great. And then if you want, for the vegans listening, if you want a vegan source, the best one is an 80-20 mix of pea and rice protein. So 80% pea protein, 20% rice protein. That gives an amino acid profile that is most like that of high quality protein sources, because that's actually what a high protein quality source is. It means the amino acid profile in the source is essentially like that of the body, or at least as the body needs, because the body doesn't have a protein requirement. We simplify it to that, but actually the protein or the body has an amino acid requirement for every individual amino acid, especially the essential amino acids. So a high quality source essentially makes sure that when you consume a certain amount of protein, you're getting all of these amino acids, and it's also digestible and bioavailable.
Yes, that won't be a problem for this audience. Everyone is pretty much meat-based here. But it's great to know, for anyone who isn't, that's sort of a good ratio for them, to look for. Now, just moving over to the concept of protein in general and protein leverage, I'd love to get your latest thoughts on this. I'm a huge fan of Robbenheimer and Simpson's work, and I've had them on the podcast to talk about their protein leverage hypothesis. Now, I think you disagree a little bit on protein being the most satiating macronutrient. I'm curious if you still believe that, and I know that you've done some research on it as well.
Yes, I co-authored a randomized controlled trial in strength training individuals, where we keep most things the same, energy intake, and we have one group going really high in protein. It's actually a 2-part study, and one group going just high, sufficiently high. about 1.8 and 2.7 gram per kilogram per day. So basically one group is at the sort of optimal level and the other group adds 50% to that. And then we found no differences across a wide array of measurements in how satiated they were, how hungry they were, how much energy they ate ad libitum. So without in tracking. And that aligns with most literature that basically confirms the protein leverage hypothesis, which is that your body is sort of seeking a certain amount of protein, like a protein thermostat, protein stat, to make sure that you get that amount of protein. And if you don't, it keeps your appetite up. You can see this very well in animals in particular. They sort of keep eating until they've had enough protein. Now, after this point, the relationship basically disappears. And there have been a few meta-analyses, and especially elderly individuals, a lot of studies showing that if you give them more protein at this point, they actually sometimes overeat, especially if it's like whey shakes, because they just pass through and they don't really satiate. So I think it is very important to consume enough protein. And by that, I mean, not the typical government recommendations of like 0.8 or 0.9, but actually at least 1.2 and probably 1.6 to 1.8 minimum per day, consistently every day. After that point, I think you don't need to worry about consuming more protein. You'd be better off with fiber sources or just high volume food, low energy density food, rather than making sure you have the protein, right? At that point, I think it's almost uncontestable, at least, that other factors will matter more than protein intake per se. Because again, if you're gonna down whey shakes, it's just not satiating. I don't think anybody really feels that way. That if you just consume a lot of whey shakes, no appetite, diet's fine, no problems.
Yeah, no, that's great. And I think this is important to talk about, because one of the questions I think, and I'm sure you get it all the time, is how to balance optimizing for getting lean, growing your muscle, and balance out optimizing for longevity. And the way that I tend to look at it is, you have your goal of building lean mass, getting to a certain leanness. High protein is great for that, but sort of once you get there, should you continue to do high protein for the rest of your life? Is that going to optimize for longevity or for, hormonal balance? Maybe not necessarily. Maybe once you're at that point, it makes more sense to switch to more of a maintenance protocol, something like a well-balanced, well-formulated keto diet, or a sort of high carb, low fat approach with, optimal protein as opposed to high protein. And some of the theories behind this, I'm sure you've seen a lot of the research, but, I'm curious what your thoughts are on with regards to fiber specifically, which you just brought up, because there are some theories that if you are not getting any fiber, then, some of the protein or the amino acids are going to be providing an energy or fuel source for the microbiome. And that if that's happening, there are some toxic byproducts as a part of that, as opposed to if you're providing fiber where they can make, these like butyrate different molecules from that. Yeah. So what are your thoughts on, just doing sort of high protein to optimize for getting lean versus, how do you eat in general to optimize for overall like health and longevity and hormones and those things?
I think there is very little divergence between health and physique goals overall. And the only divergence occurs, I think, especially the stigma of like bodybuilders, due to drug use, A, and B, going to like contest level leanness levels, which is far below what anyone would do if you're not actively preparing for a photo shoot or a contest. It's maybe 1 in 100 individuals that would sort of accidentally dip into that range of body fat. Like, oh, didn't eat that much last week. Now I have striations on my glutes.
Yeah.
So I think for most people, as long as you stay in somewhat sane body fat level ranges, more exercise basically is healthier, at least up to a point. There are benefits, and there's, at least with strength training, very little risk of overdoing it. Body fat wise, also, people generally get healthier, they get leaner. Macronutrient profile wise, I think there's a lot of research showing that energy restriction, which I think is a little odd. They say like energy restriction improves longevity, but obviously you can't just be in energy deficits the rest of your life because you would starve. So I think it is more fair to say that staying lean is good for longevity. And whether you go high fat, high carb, most research finds that the ratio of carbs to fat does not matter so much. There is some research leaning towards high fat being better or general carb restriction being better. I think that's more due to food choices because like fruits, veggies are not going to be the culprit. It's more starches, especially processed ones, especially in type 2 diabetics. But overall, not as big a factor as just energy restriction. Like if you just take an individual that stays lean, and even if they had a crappy diet with lots of processed carbs, they're probably still healthier than someone that has a really good ketogenic diet but is obese. So, just to put things in perspective.
Yes.
Protein, there's one recent review on this, which aligns with most other reviews, I think, that protein intake per se is not related to longevity or health outcomes. So, like I said, if you're consuming excess protein, maybe if you're not consuming any carbohydrates, that you get deleterious effects on the gut microbiome, but overall not major and probably not relevant to most individuals other than people on a carnivore diet. I think high protein is probably not a big concern because the body would just oxidize the excess for energy. Now, I would say that the research is not crystal clear that it's not a concern. So I think there is something to be said to be, at the more near the optimal intake than say double the optimal intake, if longevity is your main goal. Plus, there's not much reason to be at double the optimal intake unless you're really, you're really into barbecues and stuff.
No, that's a great answer. And, I think it's just exactly what you said, that optimal protein intake, is probably the best approach. And what do you say to people who talk about sort of the health risks? I know you sort of answered the question, but in terms of cancer, overactivation of mTOR with eating higher protein amounts.
Yeah, that's one of those things that I think is misinterpreted a lot, because for one, cancer is specific to a body part, right? And so is mTOR. It's actually specific to certain cells. Now you activate mTOR in muscle tissue. Nobody gets muscle cancer. So I don't think it's a concern to do. I mean, by that theory, exercise itself would be carcinogenic because it activates a lot of mTOR. We know that the opposite is true. Exercise is very protective against cancer. So I don't think that theory has a lot of merit. Now, maybe elevated insulin and IGF-1 levels, those are theoretically linked, sex hormone levels as well, to certain types of cancer. But when we actually look at the empirical data, we don't see strong relations of high fat intakes for women, for example, and breast cancer has been refuted by lots and lots of research. And most research finds hormone replacement therapy, for example, to have neutral effects on all-cause mortality, even though they result in a substantial increase in sex hormone levels, both estrogen and testosterone, over the course of someone's life. If you start at say, age 50 and you get 80 years old, 30 years of probably double, triple the hormone levels, no effect on all-cause mortality, and also no clear increase in cancer prevalence. So overall, I'd say I wouldn't be terribly worried about it.
Yeah, that's good. It's good to know, I think, and it's just reaffirming for people who are, wanting to eat sort of a higher protein or optimal protein approach, but they worry about, a lot of the warnings out there that they see of, cancer from eating red meat or that kind of thing. And it's sometimes difficult for them to, justify those intakes with a lot of people in the general public having those beliefs, which we try to.
Yeah, that's another one of those myths. They just won't die. Red meat as well, red meat being unhealthy. Several recent reviews and meta-analyses find that it's mostly neutral. It's a very good source of nutrients, and it does not have adverse health outcomes, especially not unprocessed meat.
Yeah, so that's a great topic. So I think a lot of people understand that beef is, and lamb, like ruminant meats, are in general like pretty nutrient dense, but then the processed meats, and the nitrates, they worry about those.
Yeah, I think overall the research does trend towards the distinction there, although it's actually not as clear as you would think. Like theoretically, you would basically think, well, whole meat, just beef, steak, good. Processed bacon, like charcoal grilled barbecue meats, probably bad. But research actually doesn't find even that big of a difference. Now, I think in most studies, it's a bit hard to make the distinction, especially when you have epidemiological research, because people also don't have an easy time for themselves, defining what is processed and unprocessed meat. And if you have normal beef, but you just grill it enough, basically, and it gets charcoal black, then it's essentially processed meat. So it's a bit of a difficult distinction to make, but I would definitely err in the direction of that is the relevant distinction.
I have one last question about protein and research, and that is with regards to the thermic effect of protein. So there's different theories on what is responsible for that thermic effect that is so high in protein. And for a long time, I believed that it was due to the, additional processing and breaking down, polymer into these polymer chains into individual amino acids, and maybe some of the nitrogen sequestering and that kind of thing. But I just came across some info about, I think it was Dr. Don Layman was talking about John Newell, perhaps, and his research. And he was theorizing that the thermic effect of protein is not from the breaking down the protein, but it's more so from actual muscle protein synthesis, which is actually a very energetically intensive or has a high energy demand. So then you're basically, your muscles would be then using a lot of maybe the stored fatty acids there or glycogen in order to synthesize that new muscle. And that is what is creating the thermic effect. And I'd love to know your thoughts on that.
That's exactly right, I would say. And that's also why we don't see very clear relations between additional protein intake and higher thermic effects in people that already have a decent protein intake. And it's also why we don't see clear effects of protein processing on the thermic effect, because it still results in protein synthesis. So yeah, I'd say that's 100% correct.
Yeah, when I came across it, I actually thought it made sense in terms of when you see some research showing that, people eating these higher intakes of protein would be getting more fat loss, but then you're right. Once you maximize the leucine threshold, then there's no additional benefit. So, so I'm guessing that you're not a big proponent of OMAD for people who are wanting to get lean and build muscle then.
No, especially not with that last part. They want to build muscle. Like maybe GOMAD, but OMAD, no.
What's GOMAD? Like 2 meals a day?
Yeah, gallon of meal a day. Or gallon of milk a day. It's
gallon of milk a day.
Yeah, old. I think it originated very long ago, actually, in sort of early bodybuilding type cultures, where they were like, yeah, just eat a lot of beef and eggs and lots of milk, which was probably mostly successful because it helped people just consume more energy.
Right.
But it sort of stood the test of time and became, now more of a meme, but originally sort of a slogan for people to consume a lot of energy and protein, essentially.
Now, this is one of the biggest questions that I have is relating to lean gains and the effect of lean gains. So in order to build muscle, we know that it's generally accepted that it's not a good idea to be in too much of a caloric deficit because, as we just discussed, protein synthesis is, energy intensive. However, if someone has a lot of stored energy on their bodies, then can't they use that stored energy to build muscle, say, if they're like mostly just eating protein?
They definitely can. In fact, the body does not need a lot, mostly protein, to build muscle, and it can take the energy from its own energy stores. So another one of those myths that just won't die is the idea that you can't build muscle in energy deficit. And it's absolutely ludicrous on absolutely every level, because for one, in dozens of studies, it occurs. People gain muscle and lose fat at the same time. Mechanistically speaking, it also makes no sense. Like if you just think about it, what it would mean if the body could not accrue lean body mass in energy deficit. Let's say you have someone in hospital after heart surgery. The heart is a muscle. and they're on a hospital diet, probably in energy deficit, especially if you're a strength trainee, then you're just not getting enough food. Their heart could not recover if that were true. So it's absolutely false. The only thing, well, the truth to it is that if you're a relatively advanced trainee that already has a substantial amount of muscle, then it's going to be much more difficult to build muscle in energy deficit than in energy surplus. And even in novice individuals, there's probably some difference, although research does not really find it that well. There's actually a meta-analysis on this from this year that found the energy deficit does not impact strength development, but it does impact muscle growth. So
it's interesting.
I think, yeah, that summarizes it pretty well.
What is your opinion on protein sparing modified fasts for fat loss? Personally, I think they're a great tool for fat loss, especially when compared with like water fasting. And that's something I want to get into next as we shift into your new book. And we're going to talk about sort of self-control and willpower. Now, people out there who use water fasting for fat loss, there's a lot of reasons why I don't like it, but one of them actually relates to willpower. And I believe it just takes so much willpower for people to do water fasting for extended periods of time that it makes it unsustainable, and that eventually they'll sort of use all their willpower and they will like overeat and just ruin what they've done with the fast. Whereas if you're doing something like a protein sparing modified fast, you're just focusing on protein to prevent muscle loss. And if you have a lot of energy stored in your body, you can utilize that. So what's your opinion on that, those two different tools, I guess, for fat loss?
I think the protein sparing modified fast is what economists would call a dominant option compared to water fasting. The dominant option is an option that is better in every possible scenario than the other one. So there is basically no utility of water fasting in my view, because even the only purported benefit that you might think you get if you're doing a water fast is you're getting more fat loss, right? Because you have a low energy intake. But even that is false. If you have an individual that's eating nothing and one individual that eats, say, only protein up to their optimal amount and then no more, then the individual only consuming protein will actually lose more fat, because the protein up to that point will not contribute to energy metabolism, will only be used for protein synthesis, which will increase energy expenditure, therefore resulting in a greater gap between energy consumption and energy expenditure, therefore resulting in more fat loss. Plus, they will not lose lean body mass, and any lean body mass that you lose, even if you don't care about muscle, which you should, then, and not just because people should get jacked, but you should not lose your lean body mass if you're not training. Then that's also going to be your organs and other stuff. So if you're losing lean body mass, any lean body mass that you lose is energy loss. That is not fat loss. So those things are mutually exclusive, right? The body is taking care of, they're getting rid of energy, and it's either coming from fat or from lean body mass. If it's coming from lean body mass, you're not losing the fat. So even for that, even for the fat loss, it's better. And then you also get better muscle retention. It's much easier for diet adherence, willpower, appetite regulation, like absolutely everything. So I'm actually a big proponent of protein sparing modified fast.
Yes.
And clearly not a proponent of any type of water fasting.
Yeah, I'm so glad that you agree. And I know that there are a lot of people using that as a tool for fat loss, and it just has so many negative long-term effects, like in terms, a lot of them that you mentioned, but also just like down regulating your metabolism and everything. But I also find that eating that much amount of protein, you're going to get that much more fat loss. Some people argue, well, if you were fasting, then ancestrally, it wouldn't make sense for your body to break down muscle or to break down protein or lean mass if you couldn't find food when your body has all this fat that it could use to burn for energy. But you still have that risk potentially of losing muscle, right?
Yeah, this is actually why we have the protein stat, because we don't have efficient means of storing protein other than lean body mass, which is mostly muscle mass, because you're not going to double your liver size. So the body actually has mechanisms in place to make sure that we don't do water fasting, that we do get protein. So if you're not doing that, the body does not want you to lose lean body mass, especially if you're overweight, you have a lot of fat tissue, but it has no substrate, right? It needs protein for the heart and other more important things than your biceps. So it's going to eat up your biceps and use that protein to keep fueling your liver, your heart, and things that in the grand scheme of things do matter a bit more than being jacked.
Right. I just did an episode on that last week talking about, your body needs amino acids for so many things and proteins,
Right.
including hormones and everything aside from just building muscle, which is why it's so important to get enough. That's a really good point. And,
one figure, by the way, on that you might find interesting is that one review paper found, I think this was in sedentary individuals, but still only 10% of protein intake is used for muscular tissue. And
that makes sense.
I think up to 80, 90 grams per day, especially in a bigger individual, can be used purely by the digestive system.
Wow. Yeah, that's incredible. I would love to see that. Take a look at that. That's really phenomenal. I'm curious if you think that fasting has a place, in context of autophagy and protein turnover. There is a significant amount of protein turnover that occurs in the body. Do you ever personally do fasting, like seasonal fast or, those kinds of things for autophagy, or do you think you get enough just from exercise?
I think you get enough from exercise and energy deficits. Currently, there's no literature indicating that fasting per se results in more autophagy than a similar degree of energy restriction not from fasting. So a lot of people are under the mistaken belief that fasting is sort of the only switch for autophagy, but autophagy is just a cellular cleanup mechanism that the body that's active at all times and more in energy deficit.
Yes, I thought I've sort of tried to explain it's like the cellular recycling program, in your cells, like recycling all these misfolded organelles and proteins and things. But it's always occurring unless you are continuously in the fed state.
Right. And a study by Templeman et al. From I think this year or end of last year actually specifically measured it, or to the degree that you can measure autophagy. I think they measured gene expression and found no difference between a group doing, I think it was complete alternate day fasting with 0 and 200% energy intakes, and one group doing 100% energy intake every day, and groups doing 75, 0 or 0, 150. So basically, alternate day fasting did not improve autophagy compared to similar energy restriction with a continuous daily energy intake.
Well, that's really interesting. I mean, it just shows it just all comes back down to calories and energy restriction or intake, no matter which way you're doing it in terms of, your hour, your eating window or your fasted window, that kind of thing. I'd love to know what your recommendations are real quickly, just for women, in terms of a lot of women listening are probably more so new to resistance training. What do you recommend for someone who is starting out, sort of, I guess, in a way to like inspire them that they can, maybe if they want to work out at home, or what's sort of like the minimum that they could do on a weekly basis to see a difference if they are eating, optimal amounts of protein to sort of maximize the effects in terms of getting lean?
In terms of both getting lean and adding strength and size, the minimum is actually very low. In fact, yes, there's research showing that the first weeks of exercising, the type of exercise actually does not matter yet, because anything is a relatively large novel stimulus compared to doing nothing before. So in the first weeks, especially, you'll basically maximize muscle growth very easily. And then relatively quickly, things get harder. So you do need to get into it and work out, say, 2 times a week minimum. I think 3 times, you'll get a whole lot of the benefits, especially for women. If you're, say, working out at home, and if you have the typical, like mostly bikini type focused goals, which is more booty building, some delt growth in the shoulders, X taper, but not like huge arms, big pecs, big traps, those kind of things, then you have a lot of time that you can dedicate to those body parts, which makes it easier to add enough volume. And in just 2 workouts per week, you can actually achieve very good results already.
Wow, just 2 a week. I would have thought you would say 4 a week. That's amazing.
No, I think with 2, you can already 2 times 1 hour, you can get pretty far. Now, if you want to be on stage, you're probably gonna have to do more, but
right,
for
right.
beginners, yeah.
Well, that's fantastic. And do you have any recommendations for women on, what to focus on? Do you think that like women can do enough just if they're doing like calisthenics or body weight exercises at home?
You could. I think it is important to educate yourself, to know why you're doing what you're doing, and to find activities that you enjoy. Like some people enjoy cardio more, some people enjoy strength training more. And then if you want to get toned, which is essentially body recomposition, so you should know you want basically just more muscle, less fat, then you want high protein diet, strength training. Calisthenics you could do, but there's not really a benefit compared to doing, say, hip thrusts, split squats at home, just types of bodyweight exercises. With just very little weights or even just filled water bottles, you could do lateral raises quite effectively. And yeah, you have quite some good options, especially for the lower body and the quads, glutes in particular for women. So I'd say it's actually not too difficult.
That's great. Now, I'd love to talk about your brand new book and what you sort of learned in writing this book. I know that you really wanted to make it something that people could really implement into their lives sort of right away, as opposed to just reading a lot of like theory. So what made you want to write this book, and what did you learn in writing it that really surprised you?
I actually learned quite a lot of things because it's been in the making for a good 5 years overall. It's been a project that I had in the back of my mind for a long time, made a lot of notes, collected a lot of research. And I think the last 3-4 years, I actually had very clearly the idea of this specific book. And I did so much more research. Like I said, I have over 500 scientific references. I definitely did not know all of those studies before, and came across some really peculiar findings. For example, the benefits of umami taste early on in meals to increase self-control and decrease energy intake. Funny enough, there have been 2 studies published relatively recently, over the past few years at least, that find soups with MSG, like monosodium glutamate, the notorious Chinese artificial flavor enhancer, actually improve self-control and decrease energy intake compared to soups without it.
Oh, wow.
I don't necessarily advocate MSG, although I think it's safe. Most research finds it safe. But if you eat, for example, mushrooms or tomato and probably certain types of meat, you can also get this effect, at least to a certain extent. Now, tomatoes and mushrooms are probably best because they have free glutamate. And in most high-quality protein sources, it's bound. And you also have a lot of other amino acids which might cancel out the effects because you want the glutamate to activate receptors in the mouth. And that's better if it's in free form. So yeah, that's one of those stranger than fiction.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And when I first started looking into umami, I was amazed to see that it's the whole reason why Italian food is so amazing. It's basically just all umami, tomatoes, mushrooms, Parmesan is, I think, one of the highest sources, pizza, so much of the food that they create. And I think, I guess also truffle would be a mushroom, but so many of the foods that are, just quintessentially Italian foods are like just a whole serving of umami.
Yes, definitely. It's mostly renowned for Japanese cuisine, but you're absolutely right that it's also very prevalent in Italian cuisine.
Yeah. So you learned some really interesting things in the book in terms of sort of self-control and willpower and productivity. So, what's sort of the difference between, say, self-control and willpower?
Very little. I think researchers generally talk about self-control, and willpower is a more colloquial term, so more informal, but mostly people mean the same thing. It's, in essence, willpower is your ability to rationally override your emotions. That's in large part what it comes down to. It's the ability to set long-term goals, to invest in things, to do things that you may not enjoy now, but will provide benefits in the future. most things you require willpower for or self-control are things of this nature, investment type activities.
Right. Now, one thing that I learned from an author that I love, she wrote a book called The Four Tendencies, and she talked about how different people have different tendencies. So she had this one character quality, which is the upholder, which I find myself, which is people who are very good at achieving goals and things that they set for themselves on their own. Whereas there are sort of people who need to have an external like coach or some kind of like external person or third party. And then there's other people who need to have like stress or, you know, do you think that there's different personality types that affect that at all? Did you find any of that in the research?
Definitely. And there are big differences between individuals, between the innate capacity for self-control and to achieve certain goals, and also go into how to set goals more efficiently. For example, there's research showing that when they set goals for themselves, it's more effective to actually set a deadline. So most people, they just have a to-do list, right? It's like, I should do this. That's not very effective. It's much better to say, I should have this done by next Thursday, 4 p.m. Because then you have clear, it's more actionable. Otherwise, you just procrastinate and procrastinate. Plus, there's something called Parkinson's Law, which was originally a tongue-in-cheek comment in The Economist, I think, but actually turned out to be very scientifically valid. Basically means that activities tend to swell to take up the time allocated for the activity.
Yes.
And this is, if you wake up in the weekend and you don't have something clear to do, then you can really tell how long does it take you to get up and running for the day. Or on holidays, a lot longer than when you have to be at work in, say, 90 minutes, right? So that's a clear example of this, not to be confused with the disease, by the way. And research also finds that when people set deadlines, they are more productive, but also that they should set their deadlines more strictly than they intuitively would, in part because of this law. And the sweet spot, or based on the limited research we have on this, sweet spot seems to be about a third less. So if you think, I'm going to need 3 days for this, make it 2. Like, you should push yourself, because you can probably do it in 2. Like most things that we think like, I should, take this amount of time. No, think more like, what could I possibly squeeze it in? And then do that. Because if you're a bit stressed or you have deadlines, if they're artificial or self-created, it amps us up. And if you've done all-nighters at college, then sometimes when I look back, I was the all-nighter type initially until I got my stuff together in 3rd year of my bachelor, and my life changed a lot. But until that time, sometimes now if I look back, it's amazing what I could do in 8 hours where I would normally be sleeping. But you can't just, summon up that level of willpower and dedication. Like, you need some internal, some external stress. It helps for a lot of people. Like, even if you're a very dedicated person, like you say, a boulder type individual, then you probably still benefit from just being that bit of extra more strict to be even more productive.
Yeah, I wonder what it is that, accounts for those personality differences. I remember now it's Gretchen Rubin. She wrote The Four Tendencies, and she talked about these different types. I always find it very easy to stick to my goals and have self-discipline, but I know there are a lot of people who don't, and upholder is sort of a smaller percentage. So I'm not sure what accounts for that, but it's amazing how just having a coach or some kind of accountability can make a huge difference for people who it doesn't come that easily to.
Yes, and one other big theme of my book is most research finds your innate ability is, it's very nice if you have that, but it's actually much more effective in practice to simply avoid relying on willpower than having a lot of willpower. So the most successful, most productive people, you see this in students, in people at work, they're not the people who innately have the best genetics. They're the people who minimize the demands on their willpower.
Yes.
So it's, it's easier if you have a lot of willpower, but if you don't, then with planning and being smart about how you set up your day, you organize your life, your diet, you can basically make it a non-factor, because you don't need to rely on willpower.
Yes, that's how I structure my entire life. It's just, minimizing any micro decisions that I need to make in the day.
Mhm.
That's why things like protein sparing modified fast work so well for me. It's just it takes away the willpower aspect of it. So you don't really need it, as opposed to, like you said, fighting against that. I love how you also talked about, productivity during the day and how the best time to do creative work is in the mornings. I
Mhm.
usually always record my solo podcast in the mornings or do any writing then. And the best time to do group activities or meetings is later in the day, which is when I usually do like interviews and stuff. You kind of just I naturally establish that. But I thought it was interesting that you found that, sort of examining the different routines and things of really productive people.
Yep, there's good research by Ericsson et al. On this, which finds that most very successful people, they gravitate towards certain patterns and they're remarkably consistent. So it's basically the exact pattern you say, with professors and writers doing their most intellectually challenging work and creative work in the mornings, almost exclusively. Athletes and social things are generally better done at night, in part because the auditory cortex is less susceptible to fatigue than the visual cortex. Probably because we're very social animals. And language is one, actually, by many people, language is a defining feature of humanity. So we have a lot of parts of our brain are evolved specifically for the ability to process language, and it comes very naturally to us. It's also why many people in my PT courses, for example, prefer the lectures and listening rather than reading. Even though it's probably a bit slower, it is less demanding.
Yeah, and it also makes sense why audiobooks are a lot easier to
Mm-hmm.
read with your ears than with your eyes. It's more tiring, or people like fall asleep when they're reading a book.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're listening to a book or a podcast, it's much less demanding. I didn't know that was the reason why. That's really fascinating. Um, and I think you were mentioning as well with oh, this was one of my favorite things that you talked about was in terms of like office workers and people structuring their work, that if the average office worker is productive for about 3 hours during the day or
Yes.
something like that. And then you found that most of the time they're actually looking for other jobs when they're not being productive.
Yeah, there's survey data on office workers, and this is mostly self-reported, right? Anonymously, but still self-reported. So things might actually be a bit worse in reality. They find that most office workers are indeed only productive for, I think the average was 2 hours and 53 minutes per day. So basically 3 hours. That's the time they were actually doing stuff, getting things done, right? Most of the other time in their top 10 list were a lot of the things everyone would probably think, like going to the coffee machine, chatting with coworkers, having a bit extended lunch, just procrastinating, social media. But my favorite one, as you said, I think it was number 10 on the list, which was a non-trivial percentage of time spent at work, was searching for other jobs. So that's very much not what employers have in mind.
Yeah, I mean, that's always why I've preferred to contract to other people and just pay them for their work, as opposed to
Mm-hmm.
like have full-time employees, because I know that when you're working like an 8-hour shift, you're just like trying to get through it, as opposed to like if you're just being paid by the hour, you just get, that work
Mm-hmm.
done. But that was really, really interesting. And the other thing that I liked, you talked about how when people do intense work, the importance of taking sort of the same intensity of breaks really has an amazing impact on productivity. I found that really fascinating.
Yes, there's also in Ericsson's research something that really comes up a lot, and also makes sense in light of a lot of other research, that the most successful, most productive people actually take more breaks than less productive people. And it's because when they are working, they spend their work very focused. So they're very attentive, they're working hard, and they're actively working on like doing something as productively and as efficiently as possible. And the other time, they're unwinding. They're replenishing their mental energy, doing fun stuff, making sure that they don't burn out. And then you can have, if you think about it, you can have an 8-hour workday, and let's take those 3 hours of productivity. Well, if that's what you're going to work, you could get the same done in 2 bouts of 90 minutes. By the way, 90 minutes is, according to quite some lines of research, probably about a time that's a good indication, at least, of what a productive session for most people is. Longer is, depending on how much you enjoy an activity, of course, but not feasible for have-to type activities often. So I think for a lot of workers, that is also how it goes. They arrive at work, then they have one productive work bout, then they sort of slack off until lunchtime, then they have one more productive work bout, and then they slack off again. If you ask sales reps, they will also say that you should call people right when they arrive or after lunch, because those are the only times people are somewhat alive, and the other times they've just sort of zoned out and they're dead and they're in no mode. So they're not in yes mode anymore.
That's so true. I always tried to call everyone when I was in sales, like at 8 a.m. and try to get as many as I could in. And it worked well for me. And, you know, also on the receiving end of the call, that makes so much sense. You talked about sort of, I think the social network, there was a reference there that was interesting as well with the break periods.
The social network.
I think you were saying that they were doing like coding. They were doing.
Oh yes, I think from the movie, The Social Network.
Yes.
Yeah, the sort of the creating of Facebook. Yeah, they also do that there, where they have sort of a work hard, party hard kind of atmosphere, and that I think is also what a lot of companies, like the more forward companies like Google. You know, Google has nap bots, which is absolutely unthinkable in many more strict corporate type cultures.
Yeah.
But wouldn't you rather have your employee take a nap if they're tired and then go all in again? I mean, it makes so much more sense, especially for works that people have at least some intrinsic motivation for, right? But interestingly, even in factory workers, there's a lot of research from a few laws that passed, especially in England and the United States, where work hours were reduced. And collectively, this research shows that even in factory workers, where, you know, it's the ultimate, you just show up and you get paid to do a monotonous task, worker productivity stayed the same or increased when decreasing the weekly work week from 80 to 40 hours. So from 80 to 60, there was an increase, or at least the same. And then again, from 60 to 40, there was an increase, or at least maintenance of productivity. So they literally cut their work hours in half. And people were at least as productive, probably a bit more productive than before.
So if they cut it to 20, then what happens?
Yeah, that's still to be determined. But I think for a lot of people, especially if we look at that kind of research where, you know, most people are active for like 3 hours a day. I think most entrepreneurs I've talked to also will admit that 4, maybe 5 is a really good work day. Like if you're actually spending 5 hours really getting stuff done, you are so productive.
That's a stellar day.
Yes, definitely. You're going to be a wildly successful individual if you can keep that up. But you know, the 8 hours is just completely unrealistic.
It is. And I remember when I started working for myself, I used to work in finance, and I started working for myself, and my dad was afraid that, like, if I wasn't in an office and I was working for myself, it's like, you know, how are you going to get work done and not like goof off? And actually find that you want to get your work done so you can go goof off, you know, you just like it's your time, you own it now. So it makes you want to be more focused. And at the same time, I didn't realize that those breaks that you are taking help you to be more productive and burn out a lot less than if you're like pushing, you know, in that sort of setting all the time.
Definitely. And they're more productive when you preempt that feeling of feeling like you can't do anything anymore. Like when you feel like your attention is fading, that's when you already want to take a break. And then you don't want to just go on Facebook or Instagram. Then you want to do something you actually enjoy, like watching one series of Modern Family, for example, 20-minute episode is perfect.
Yeah.
Just one match of a video game or something.
Yeah.
Something that's really immersive, you know, really takes you out of it, so that afterwards you can come back in with a clean mind. It's much like meditation. You want something that basically, as a computer analogy, empties your mental cache. And you know, you can go back in with a clean, empty mind.
You have to lower the entropy. That's what I always found with meditation. It's one of the only activities that actually lowers it. What did you find with social media, like in terms of if people are doing that on their breaks, which I think a lot of people do?
It's actually negative. And there's even research showing that 2 studies from this year, one from past year, show that social media usage I think in between sets, but also pre-workout, actually decreases workout performance. Now, it depends, of course, on what you do. Educational content does not have these effects. So in these studies, watching a documentary, interestingly, because most people would think that's boring, right? Did not have adverse effects. Whereas just if you have people blindly be on Instagram or Facebook, and they're probably just going to look at like famous models and stuff that makes you think your life sucks because everyone's life is so awesome, then that works adversely. So I think it's most people, it's not that social media, but many people say social media is bad. Social media is not bad. It's the type of content that you purvey, and it's the things that get popular really brainlessly. Those things are kind of bad. But there's also a lot of good stuff in social media.
I was going to say, when I open mine, I've curated my feed. So it's just like stoicism or something interesting. It usually gives me like a good idea or something like that, but I don't follow any accounts that make me feel bad or like not as good as when I started. But it is hard to do that because you never know what's going to show up, right?
Yes, that's exactly in line with my book. Like I go into the guidelines of how to set up your browser, what kind of homepage to use, how to set almost your desktop, your wallpaper on your phone. All of those things can be optimized to make sure that all the stimuli you get in a day are positive ones, and you don't fill up your brain with a lot of noise.
Yes, that makes so much sense. Now, is there anything about your book that you'd like to share that we haven't covered?
You should buy it.
Yeah.
I think actually would not recommend someone to just buy the book because it's not for everyone. Like if you're not into science, for example, then book's not for you. I do think this is probably my most accessible work I've ever published because if you go to my Instagram or Facebook, that's pretty reserved for very serious strength trainees. If you're like, working out twice at home, you might think quite some of it's boring or like way over the top. But the book is probably relevant for, I think, almost anyone that values their self-improvement. So yeah, I think people should have a look and see if it's something they fancy.
Absolutely. Now, just as we wrap up, I'd love to know, what is your daily routine like? And then, of course, what do you eat in a day? I think those are great questions to finish off on.
Yeah, my routine is very much like yours, exactly as I recommend in the book. Mornings are most intellectual work, research. I do most of my interviews and podcasts. Later on in the day, video calls with clients, consultations as well. In between, I have my workouts in the afternoon, and I do most of my client emails. And then sometimes late at night, I do some like administrative work that you don't need brain power for. And I make sure that I have my to-do list ready so that the next morning when I wake up, I know exactly what I have to do. I don't need to spend any time thinking, what am I going to do today? I know this is at least my one task. And I recommend that most people have at least one thing every day that's like, this is what I have to do today, so that there's no completely unproductive day in your entire life, basically. And I have going up to about 4 meals because I'm bulking now, and it becomes difficult sometimes with 3. But I'm still currently at 3 meals, spread relatively equally across the day, with workouts sandwiched exactly as I said. Very high protein, very much in line with everything we discussed. So I do actually walk the talk.
Yeah, and I'm imagining you do sort of a low-ish carb approach.
Yeah, when bulking, it sometimes becomes hard, so I generally go higher in carbs. But when cutting, I almost always cut out all the starches first, like maybe potatoes, but those go out very quickly, and then it's mostly berries and veggies as my and still high protein. I try to keep the fats in because I think it's important and very unsustainable if you go below 20% fat intake, especially for women. Men can get away with it a bit better, I think, but women not so much. Just the positive effects on sex hormone levels and appetite of fat seem to be more pronounced in women than men. So yeah, very much in line with everything we discussed.
Yeah. Are there any training differences at all between men and women?
Not much, like especially not at the beginning level. Like if you get more advanced, then there are some finer points that become relevant.
Okay.
Because generally you can get away with shorter rest periods, you can rack up more volume. You should not use men's type programs like 3 sets of 10 at 65% of 1RM or 70% of 1 RM, because you can probably do more as a woman. You actually have better core capacity, and you can typically do more reps at a given percentage than men because of numerous factors, including generally better metabolic health and better blood flow perfusion. So also typically a bit more type 1 muscle fibers. You can take advantage of that, but I think most of those things are pretty intuitive. Most thing at the beginner level is to realize that you should sort of train like a man, but do so with the body parts that you value the most. Because another thing that I see in women, that sort of, they get the main points, like you should do strength training to look the way I want to. You should do high protein diet, but then they literally take a man's program and they're like doing a lot of trap volume, you know, a lot of chest exercises. They have a push day, which is all like chest work. It's like, do you really want your pecs to become a lot bigger? Like, no. So why are you doing, you know, a day mostly dedicated to chest work? Like, yeah,
Right.
that's what I read. No, but you should do similar type exercises, but for the body parts you value more.
That makes sense. Now, for my very last question, if you could put one thing on a billboard that the whole world would get to see, what would it be?
I would buy the biggest billboard there is in the world, like maybe somewhere in Dubai or Singapore, or New York, and I would leave it completely empty.
That's awesome.
A break from all the ads and crap that we get, you know,
Yeah.
pushed into our minds every single day that we
Yes.
didn't ask for.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. That's amazing. Well, Menno, thank you so much for being here with us today. Where can everyone follow you online, find your work, and buy your book?
MennoHenselmans.com, you'll find everything. I'm on Facebook and Instagram, but you also find that all on the website. Probably the easiest way if you're really into fitness, like you're into serious strength training, is to subscribe to my email course. You also see that on the homepage. And then you get a free course of like my most popular contents and things that people enjoy the most, all free, delivered to your inbox.
Oh, that sounds amazing. I'll definitely be signing up for that. Well, Menno, thank you so much for taking the time and answering all my questions. We really appreciate it. And it was an honor to have you on Fast Keto today.
My pleasure.
All right, you guys, thank you so much for tuning into the episode. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did and got some great takeaways from it. He really shared so much great information when it comes to protein intake, thermic effect of protein, you know, fasting versus eating protein